Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Practical Organic Living. In today's episode, we'll be talking about transplanting tomatoes. Transplanting tomatoes is everybody's favorite part of the year because soon you'll have nice, gorgeous, juicy red tomatoes or orange tomatoes. So in today's episode, I'll be talking about what to do before you transplant tomatoes, while you transplant tomatoes, and after you transplant tomatoes. So without further ado, let's get into it. The three things you want to do before you transplant is number one, prepare the soil. Number two, check the weather. And number three, prepare your soil amendments and fertilizers if you choose to fertilize. So the practical thing to do before planting your tomatoes and preparing your soil is to constantly amend your soil. Now, for those who may not have the best soil, or for those that are starting new gardens, it's pretty easy. All you have to do before planting tomatoes and transplanting tomatoes is to mix a lot of compost before you dig into the soil. And I'll be showing that a bit later. Number two, check the weather. You want to make sure that it's not too hot when you transplant your tomatoes outside, meaning you don't want the weather to be 80 to 90 degrees outside. You want the weather to be preferably around 60 to 70 degrees during the day and high 40s to low 50s at night. This is important because when you're transplanting the tomatoes outside from your house or from your growing area, you don't want the tomatoes to go through transplant shock. And transplant shock occurs when the tomatoes are suddenly put into an environment that they're not adapted to. That's why you want the weather to be as mild and temperate as possible before you transplant the tomatoes outside. And number three, as for preparing your soil amendments and fertilizers, make sure you have your fertilizer or your soil amendment handy and with you before you start transplanting tomatoes. So here is an example of a soil amendment that I'll be using for demonstration purposes only because, as I'll explain in future episodes, I actually don't fertilize my tomatoes with fertilizers you buy from outside the store. We use our homemade compost, and I apply that during the season. But for most of us who don't have access to a lot of compost, or homemade fertilizer, the most practical thing to do is to actually have organic fertilizer of your choice or fertilizer of your choice ready before you transplant. So now, let's get to transplanting tomatoes. So the first step to do during transplanting is to dig the hole. So let me dig the hole for you and I'll let you see what the hole should look like before you transplant your tomatoes. So what I'll be doing is to dig a hole that's about the width of this tomato trellis I have right here. And I won't actually be digging too deeply because the soil is pretty good as it's a raised bed. So let me show you what the soil looks like when I start digging. You want your soil to be moist, but not waterlogged. And you want the soil to be loose and crumbly and easy to work with. So what I also like to do when I'm digging is to actually feel the soil. Sometimes I'll crumble a little bit just to check the consistency of the soil. Make sure it's not too wet or not too dry. So the second thing to do when you're transplanting is to mix in the soil amendments or fertilizer. So I have in my hand what I showed you earlier, a granular organic fertilizer. So what you want to do is make sure you mix this in and mix this in with the soil really well. So another thing you can mix in is, besides fertilizer, is something with a calcium source like garden lime or gypsum. And the reason you want to do that is you want to make sure that the tomatoes have a lot of calcium in the soil. And the reason you want to do that, to have a lot of calcium in the soil, is because you want the tomatoes to not develop something called blossom end rot. And I'm sure I'll show you some examples of blossom end rot later on in the season. We actually don't add any calcium in here because I've already put a lot of eggshells in here when we're composting from the eggs we eat. And there's some other calcium sources that we've put in here during the years so that there's a lot of calcium in the soil. So this is what the soil should kind of look like before you start planting the tomatoes. So the next thing to do is to actually plant the tomatoes. And let me show you how I'm gonna be doing that. So the thing about tomatoes, as you'll read everywhere else, is that they're actually gonna be growing out roots from all over the stem, wherever you place them. So that means you actually want to plant the tomatoes as deep as possible, as deeply as possible, because they will grow roots throughout the stems, and that way the roots that you bury in the soil can actually focus on finding as much water and nutrients deep in the soil. This is crucial because in the summer months, when the soil gets dry, the roots will already be well established underneath, and they will already have a lot of access to water and nutrients. If you were to plant the tomato above grade or above the ground, what that's going to do is that's going to encourage a very shallow root structure when you water the tomatoes. And when you do that during the summer, when it's really hot and really dry, your tomato roots will not have a lot of access to water. What that happens is that the plant will not be able to absorb the water that it needs during the hot parts of the summer. And when the soil dries out and gets wet after you water the soil, the tomatoes won't be able to take in that calcium, and you'll get the blossom end rot. Not because you don't have enough calcium, but because you're not giving the plant consistent moisture in the soil. So the best way to avoid all of that is to actually plant the tomato roots as deeply as you can in the soil. And another thing before I plant the tomato is that you want to make sure that it's not too cold, that the soil temperature is not too cold. That's why it's so crucial to check the weather before you plant, because if I were to plant this tomato deeply and the soil temperature is really cold underneath, that's going to happen is that the tomato roots will just sit there and they won't grow. And when that happens, they'll rot and that plant will eventually die. So let me start planting this. So what I'm going to do right now is to actually take the tomato plant out of the pot, and we can take a look at its root structure. And you see pretty good root growth all along the plant, so it's definitely ready to be transplanted. So this is about the height that I would transplant a tomato. As you can see, when I fill the soil, it should be about the height of the new growth coming out. So I talked about what to do before you transplant, during you transplant, and this is what you do after you transplant. The first thing to do after you transplant is to backfill the hole. So let me show you how I'm going to be doing that. You just want to put the soil that you dug back, and then you want to lightly or gently press it down. You don't want to leave a lot of air gaps, but what I've discovered is that when you water the plant deeply, the gravity of the water will actually help fill in those air gaps. So let's get to watering the tomato. So now I'll be watering the tomatoes, and let me show you how I water the tomatoes. I have here a watering can that's about 2 gallons, and that's the amount I'll probably use to water the tomatoes. So as I mentioned before, you want to make sure that your tomatoes are watered deeply and properly the first time around. When you transplant them, you want the soil around them to also be moist so that they're not going to dry out the soil that you just transplanted your tomato in. So the ideal thing to do is actually to use a soaker hose and to water this over 30 minutes. But it's not practical for everybody to water the tomatoes. So I usually try to water this as slowly as possible and make sure that I really soak the soil all around the tomatoes. Okay, so as you can see, we watered the tomatoes, and I've dumped about 2 gallons of water in about 30 seconds. But what I want to tell you is that your soil should be well draining to the point that the water drains pretty quickly. So as you can see, if you take a look at the soil, the water's pretty much gone now. But that's not because the soil is too sandy. It's because there's lots of organic matter, and then there was a lot of air pockets that the water helped compress. So it's probably hard to pick this up on camera now, but before the soil levels was a little bit more raised, and now it's pretty much all flat. So the water did the trick. You don't need to be stomping the ground around your tomatoes. It's not going to lead to a good tomato harvest. The last thing to do after you transplant is to mulch your tomatoes. This is a crucial step in ensuring a good tomato harvest. So actually, I'm not going to do that today because I want the sun to warm up the soil around this raised bed. But if you were to plant later in the season, you would definitely want to do this right away. Or if you live in a pretty hot climate, you would want to do this right away. And the reason you want to mulch the soil around your tomatoes is simply you want to conserve the soil moisture so that the soil doesn't get too wet and too dry. Another benefit of mulching the soil underneath your tomatoes is that it'll provide a nice habitat for the microorganisms and the soil life, so they can continue decomposing the compost and the mulch and the fertilizers you'll be throwing onto your tomato plants during the season. So if you like this video about transplanting tomatoes, please make sure to give this video a like. And until next time, happy gardening.